We're now recording. We're going to, as
Sorry,
Lynn
that took a while.
as Lynn Ann mentioned, we're going to save a recording of this for posterity, and it will be in the on the playlist at one of the links in the chat currently, where you can also register if you haven't registered for the second webinar, which is coming up. I'll talk about that in a moment. You'll also see in the chat a link to the SUNY History Lab website, and David has kindly shared a copy of his slides for tonight's presentation as well. We'd like to thank the SUNY Center for Professional Development, the CPD, particularly Lynn Ann Hines McCoy for technical assistance and support of the webinar series. These are a project of the SUNY History Lab, which is based at SUNY Brockport, but seeks to bring together faculty, students, staff, and citizens in the state of New York and beyond who are interested in historical inquiry. Our next webinar, just to mark it on your calendar, will be on Wednesday, November 20th, from 4 to 6 p.m., a little earlier in the afternoon. Dr. April Maston of Stony Brook SUNY campus will be speaking about her research in 19th century U.S. history in a talk and presentation called Great Public Contest, the Black Irish Sport of Antebellum Challenge Dancing. This is from her new book that's going to be coming out soon. So please register at the link in the chat and join us then in November. Tonight, we are delighted to have Dr. David Hochfelder from the University at Albany SUNY campus. He'll be speaking about the public history of urban renewal in New York State. Dr. Hochfelder is Associate Professor of History at University at Albany and SUNY campus, the author of The Telegraph in America, 1832 to 1920. And along with colleagues Anne Pfau, am I saying that right, Dave? And Stacy Sewell, he is presently working on a history of urban renewal in New York State. Just one final note before I hand it over to David. You can post questions in the Q&A on our Zoom on the Zoom screen, and I can either read them for you if you wish, or after David's talk, you can unmute and ask the question yourself when I mention it. So you're welcome to ask questions in either format, whatever you prefer. We're glad to have you all here, and I'm delighted to hand it over to Dave. David, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone, for attending. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So what I want to do is talk about the public history of urban renewal in New York State, as my title slide indicates. Can you hear me and see my slides? Okay, excellent. I want to do three things tonight. First, I want to explain what urban renewal was. We find we give presentations, especially to community groups, that there's a lot of misapprehension about what exactly urban renewal was. A lot of people think that the federal government came into their cities and destroyed their cities. It was a federally funded program, largely federally funded, but these plans, urban renewal projects, were planned and carried out locally. So the federal government did not come into Rochester and say, okay, we're going to tear down this neighborhood. So I'll explain the mechanisms, what urban renewal was and how it worked. Secondly, how municipal officials and urban planners tried to persuade the public that urban renewal was desirable and even necessary for cities. And third and finally, I want to talk about some of the public programming we've done around the state. So just the scope of the program, some statistics to throw at you. It was a 25-year program. It began with the National Housing Act of 1949. This was championed by President Harry Truman, and Truman was a New Deal liberal. His goal was to ensure that every American family had decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So in Truman's mind, it began as a slum clearance program. And in places like New York City, there was a lot of slum clearance and a lot of public housing built to replace the demolished buildings. In other places, after the Housing Act was revised under President Eisenhower, urban renewal projects became more about revitalizing downtowns and increasing the tax base of particular communities. So a 25-year program, the initial goals were slum clearance and eliminating blight, so-called. The federal government paid 2/3 of the cost of an urban renewal project, which included acquiring properties through eminent domain, relocating residents and businesses, tearing down the buildings, and then improving the land and assembling the land into large disposition parcels. For a lot of places in New York, below 50,000 in population, the federal government covered 3/4 of the cost. The remainder, whether it was 1/3 or 1/4 of that remaining local obligation, the state of New York covered half of that. So a city of Rochester's size would be on the hook for 1/6 of the project cost, and a city of, oh, let's say Jamestown's size would only be on the hook for 1/8 of the project cost. And a locality could defray their local obligation through what were called non-cash grants in aid. In other words, infrastructure projects, a new school, fire station, city hall. And if a city could convince the State Department of Transportation to build an arterial, that could be banked against the city's local obligation. So this is effectively free money. Nationally, at all levels of government, local, state, and federal, the program cost around $20 billion. 1,258 municipalities around the country hosted over 3,200, almost 3,300 urban renewal projects. We estimate that around 1.35 million people were displaced for urban renewal projects. If you include urban expressways, which were often part of urban renewal projects and had, even when they were not, had very similar goals, we estimate that that effectively doubles to around 2.5 million people. What we know the demographics from federal reporting statistics, 60% of the people relocated for urban renewal projects were non-white, and this breaks down 50% African American and 10% people with Hispanic surnames. And we also know that 2/3 were tenants and 1/3 were owner-occupiers. Land area, about 156 square miles nationally of city centers were torn down. In the state of New York, all levels of government spending, local, state, and federal, about $1.6 billion spent. 91 municipalities hosted 251 projects. So New York was one of the largest, second only to Pennsylvania in number of projects, and right tied with Pennsylvania for the amount of federal funding, about $1 billion in each case. So again, when we give presentations to groups, historical societies or at public libraries, people are often kind of surprised by this. The notion is that a lot of people have is the federal government came into a municipality, a community, and dictated what would happen. That this was imposed on cities from outside. It was done to, not done by. And in fact, this was done by, not done to. And I think the best way to demonstrate this is the quote from William Slayton, who is the Urban Renewal Administration head, and he testified to Congress that a basic principle of the program is that it's a local program, locally conceived, locally planned, and locally carried out. The federal role in urban renewal is primarily one of providing financial assistance, leadership, and general program direction. And what that means is that local records are extremely important in understanding this history. If you went to Washington, D.C. to the National Archives, you would come out with a policy history of urban renewal. But that's not, in my mind, the interesting history. It's the social history. And to tell that social history, we need to go into municipal archives, local history rooms of public libraries, historical societies, and so forth. What we have found is of the roughly 90 municipalities around the state, about 1/3 to 1/2 have kept some or all of their urban renewal records in varying states of preservation or in varying conditions. In some cases, the records are pristine and complete. Auburn, New York, complete, well-organized, well-housed. Hudson, New York, they threw them under a tarp in a warehouse on the dirt floor. The warehouse had no utilities, no electricity, no heat, and animals had gotten in and nested in the records. So they were unusable. So the local records are extremely important in telling the social and public history of urban renewal. So the second main point I want to address is how municipalities sold these projects to a skeptical public. And a common strategy was to juxtapose photographs of existing blighted or slum-like conditions with what would be built to take its place. This is the Urban Renewal brochure from Kingston from the early 1960s. This doesn't quite do what I just said, but it does something a little bit different. On the left-hand side, it shows the Broadway East Urban Renewal Project area, which is an old warehouse and residential district along the Rondout Creek. And, old 19th century buildings. The Uptown neighborhood, the Stockade neighborhood in Uptown Kingston was a very affluent area and still is. And the project there involved rehabilitation and not wholesale clearance and demolition. Saratoga Springs, their promotional materials did a glance at the present, and a common theme for depicting blight was clothes on clotheslines. You see this in New York City with Robert Moses' Slum Clearance Committee. You see this in Albany to justify the construction of the Empire State Plaza. I'm not sure exactly why clothes on clotheslines had this impact, because today we look at this and say, oh, they're going green. They're not using electricity to dry their clothes. But I think in the early 1960s or 1950s, this meant that the people were too poor to own a dryer. And then this is a glimpse of the future, what this area of Saratoga Springs would look like after urban renewal. In this case, this was a public housing project, a senior citizen housing project on the upper left that actually happened. The lower right, I'm not certain that that ever got built. Now, who's the city being rebuilt for? And these are two images. The image on the left is from a HUD pamphlet that city officials often distributed to people with questions about urban renewal. And this shows a middle-class white family, obviously a heterosexual. And you see in the background a modern glass building, and then in the upper left, a church steeple. So the symbolism here is pretty clear. And then on the right-hand side, this is from a promotional brochure for Ilian's urban renewal project. And here you see the same kind of family with just a second child, an affluent husband and wife with well-dressed kids. And the goal here is to entice middle-class people to move to Ilian because urban renewal, new housing, and new highways, it's a community in motion. Who would not want to live in Ilian? And the spaces that these white middle-class families were envisioned to move around in, to populate, or spend their money in, more to the point, were depicted by these models. This is a model of White Plains, and similar models exist for a lot of other urban renewal projects. And one thing to point out about models like White Plains here, this was kind of the way that I describe it. It's like the serving suggestion on a box of cake mix. If you're a really good baker, yeah, you could probably produce what the box depicts, but maybe not. So this was a model showing downtown White Plains if the city of White Plains got a good architect hired a good architect and a good developer. So these are not necessarily buildings that ever got built. This is what an urban renewal project area could look like if the city did everything right and got the right architect and developer. So very few of these buildings in practice actually got built, or at least as depicted. This is promotional material, promotional illustration from Poughkeepsie, and this is the tagline here: Poughkeepsie is awake. is because the building depicted here, which did get built, it's a public housing project. The building is named after Rip Van Winkle. It's the Rip Van Winkle project. So that's the wordplay here. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of our publicly engaged work. A lot of this arises out of an NEH grant that we got right when the pandemic started. We got the money in April of 2020. We lost about a year and a half before we were able to start working in the summer of 2021. And this project, administered by the New York State Archives, the goal of the project was to create an inventory of urban renewal records from the 91 municipalities around the state that had urban renewal projects. Again, as I indicated a few minutes ago, we estimate that about a third to a half of municipalities, I think 40 out of 91, had some or all of their records preserved, again, in varying states of preservation. In cases, the other 50, that did roughly 50 that were the municipality either did not retain their urban renewal agency records, or where we were unable to gain access because of, like in the case of Syracuse, they said, yeah, we have the records, but you can't see them because we're concerned about privacy issues. Or when a city like, looking at you, Rome, New York, would not respond to repeated FOIL requests. So of the 90, we were able to gain access to about 40 partial to complete sets of urban renewal agency records. In the case of the other 50, we were able to backfill quite a bit by approaching historical societies, local history public librarians, and local historians. You know, city and county historians actually were very helpful with this endeavor too. As an aside, the state of New York by law has an appointed public historian for every village, town, city, county, and the 5 boroughs. And there's about 1,600 appointed public historians, and they were enormously helpful in finding these records. So that said, we were able to create inventories for almost all of the 91 municipalities. There are very few where we are unable to locate any records whatsoever. Some of the public programming that we use these records to facilitate. In Saratoga Springs, a couple of years ago, an arts workshop collaborated with the African American community on a program they called Erasing Spaces and Faces. And I'll show you that in a second. In Newburgh, we wrote a successful $50,000 National Park Service African American Civil Rights History grant to reinterpret the East End Historic District, which is where Newburgh's 2 urban renewal projects are located. And the goal here was to incorporate. So if you've seen a historic district nomination, and these can be hundreds of pages long, they go through each property, each building in exhaustive detail, who the architect was, who the original owner was, what the architectural details look like, intensely focused on the structures themselves. What we wanted to do is incorporate the social history experienced by the African American community in Newburgh to include housing discrimination, redlining, and urban renewal. So we were successful in getting that grant. Local politics intervened, and this is kind of what the danger of working with the city government, especially as dysfunctional as Newburgh. Sorry, did I say that out loud? I guess I did. We were basically thrown off the project because of the Corporation Council wanted us to sign a contract, even though we were volunteering our time to provide 100 hours of historical research. And we were happy to sign the contract, but members of the city council thought that, quite frankly, white outsiders were not the appropriate ones to do this history. So they replaced us with an African-American historian at Bard. And Beacon, across the river from Newburgh, we facilitated a museum exhibit at the Beacon Historical Society. I gave a presentation at the public library the day of the opening. And then we sat and did a podcast interview with a podcast called We Are Beacon. And then finally, this just appeared in June, we authored a Russell Sage Foundation article on reparations and how to use urban renewal records to identify people harmed and to the extent that they were financially harmed. This is an illustration by artist Marcus Kwame Anderson, and I encourage you all to look at his graphic novel on the Black Panthers. It's very well done. Marcus is on the board of the on the staff of the Underground Railroad Education Center here in Albany, and I'm on the board of UREC, so we come into contact a great deal in the past year or so. So Marcus did this illustration as part of this arts project, this community-based arts project. On the left-hand side, you see the neighborhood as it existed, and then on the right-hand side, you see the neighborhood basically being replaced with a parking lot. Newburgh, whoops. Sorry about that. My computer locked up for a second. In Newburgh, again, the existing historic district, the East End Historic District, was nominated to celebrate the efforts of white preservationists who came up from New York City or elsewhere to rehab these historic, very beautiful structures with commanding views of the river, the Hudson River, that is. And this is the historic marker that celebrates their achievement. And the first 5 brick houses, they're called the 5 bricks, were saved from demolition by Libby Line in 1974. Newburgh's preservation began on this street. Libby Line moved up from New York, bought these houses very cheaply from the Newburgh Urban Renewal Agency, rehabbed them, and then sold them to other affluent white gentrifiers. So we wanted to change that history. And in these buildings, by the way, that the Newburgh Urban Renewal Agency acquired and sold for rehabilitation, there were Black tenants. They were cut up into apartments, and there were Black tenants living in each of these 5 buildings. So this is displacement. There's no other way to describe it. So the narrative in Newburgh is to celebrate the white preservationists who rehab these houses, and does not talk about the people who were displaced for this rehab, for this rehabilitation project. And our goal was to tell that story. And again, the National Park Service African American Civil Rights History Grant enabled us to do that. We are working with a community group in Newburgh right now on a resolution. We're providing historical research support similar to what we intended with the National Park Service project. These are descendants of people displaced for urban renewal, and they are trying to get the city council to adopt a resolution similar to Asheville, North Carolina's, which will bar the city from selling off urban renewal land or rezoning it until the descendants have a seat at the table and can decide. There's about 30 acres of land in Newburgh that the city still owns that was urban renewal project land. It's where the Newburgh's Black neighborhood and downtown shopping district both were. And the descendants are basically demanding that the city council pass a resolution giving them a say in how the property, the 30 acres, gets disposed of. So we're assisting with that effort. On the upper left, this is promotional from the Beacon Historical Society's website, promoting an exhibit on urban renewal that was, I think it's still up about a year later. I'm not certain of that, but I think it was intended to be a quasi-permanent exhibit. And then bottom right is me being interviewed by This Is Beacon podcast, and Ruben and Brooke Simmons, brother and sister, are the conveners of the podcast. And Connie Perdreau, who is on the right-hand side facing me, is the daughter of, or was actually herself displaced for Beacon's Urban Renewal Project. Finally, the Russell Sage Foundation article. We collaborated with an economist at UNC Asheville because of Asheville's, because the records existed, and she had a model for how to assess what a property seized in, say, 1970 would be worth today through hedonic analysis. I'm not an economist. I don't understand exactly what hedonic analysis is, but we thought it would be a good collaboration to work with someone who could actually come up with a way to measure, quantitatively measure financial damages done to households. So we identified four mechanisms through which urban renewal harmed people who were relocated for it. And this also applies to highway, urban expressway construction as well, I should add. It's four ways where a subsidy from the poor and the powerless to the affluent and the powerful. Again, keep in mind those images of the white nuclear family and the spaces they were supposed to, or city officials wanted them to move through. That space was inhabited by poor people, usually people of color. So we can look at this as a wealth transfer from the people displaced to the people that the city was redesigned for. Secondly, especially early in the program, before the 1960s, moving expenses for both tenants and owner-occupiers were grossly inadequate. They become closer to adequate, or at least financially. You cannot compensate for psychological harm of losing your community. But the legislation improves, or reimbursement improves with legislation throughout the 1960s. And then third is inadequate compensation to owner-occupiers. And there are two ways that this really played out that the records really allow us to explore in great detail. First was the issue of land contracts. Buying on contract was a highly exploitive way that African Americans who were denied mortgage funding had to purchase homes. And this was basically a rent-to-own scheme where a buyer would have to pay 15 years of monthly payments before getting the deed. And if the buyer missed a payment or failed to fulfill the term of the contract, the buyer could be summarily evicted, having built no equity. Second way that owner-occupiers lost wealth was through what contemporaries called condemnation blight. And what this means is several years could elapse between a municipality announcing an urban renewal project and the municipality actually taking possession of the property. So in Newburgh, for example, the city announced that it was going to apply for planning funding from the federal government in 1956. Property acquisition did not occur until 1961 or 62. So in that 5 to 6 year period, tenants move out, businesses close and move elsewhere, buildings become vacant. A building that an owner bought in, say, 1955 for $15,000, by the time the Urban Renewal Agency acquired it 5 or 6 years later, the appraisers might say, oh, the building is worth $10,000 because it's vacant, it's no longer generating, rental income, and vandals have broken in and stolen all the wiring and the copper pipes. And fourth and finally, business relocations, particularly small neighborhood businesses. Businesses often lost, especially again, the small proprietors often lost money through the urban renewal acquisition process. Or more seriously, they did not get paid for things like goodwill, building up a neighborhood clientele. That's hard to replace in a new location. And a shockingly high number of businesses failed to relocate after urban renewal. So let's go through this in a little more detail. As far as the subsidy issue, that is wealth transfer from the people displaced to the people that the city was being rebuilt for, we estimate that about 0.4% of total project costs went to reimburse displacees for relocation and moving expenses and relocation costs. As the urban renewal program, federal program, evolved from 1954 through successive pieces of legislation, city officials increasingly came to view urban renewal as a way to increase the tax base. So HUD concluded in 1974, toward the end of the program, that urban renewal project land, after being turned over to developers, generated 200%, three times the assessed valuation that it had before urban renewal. So tripling the assessed value of land is definitely a subsidy from the people displaced to the municipal tax base. And economist Anthony Downs estimated, and using the HUD figures and the number of people displaced, the figures are roughly consistent. Anthony Downs testified to Congress in the mid-60s that he regarded this as a subsidy of about $300 from each person displaced to the municipality. And then the other way this was a subsidy, or a transfer of wealth rather, was to property developers. So in the case of Newburgh, the clearance for the East Newburgh, the second urban renewal project carried out there, clearance cost $1.7 million. That is acquiring the land, moving people out, demolishing the buildings, and assembling the smaller residential parcels into large development parcels. So that cost $1.7 million. But the city of Newburgh priced the land for sale, for resale, at less than $50,000. So another way to look at urban renewal is this was a massive subsidy to private developers, massive land write-down program. As far as inadequate relocation reimbursement for tenants, before 1956, tenants received nothing, not even moving expenses. For an 8-year period after that, they received $100 for moving expenses. For another 4-year period after that, $200 for moving expenses, and then a $500 rental supplement for a year. And this was because that rent supplement was paid because what federal officials came to realize is that urban renewal actually worsened housing shortages in a lot of communities, especially affordable housing, and that relocated families were forced to pay higher rents to endure longer commutes to jobs, or if they wanted to pay the same rent, they would get less housing, less quality, worse housing for the amount they were paying. So in 1968, there's another bump up that $200 for moving expenses and $1,000, sorry, that's not 10,000, $1,000 rent supplement for 2 years. And then finally, the Uniform Relocation Act. And by 1971, to be quite frank, 90% of relocations had already occurred under this program. So, but the Uniform Relocation Act does finally make tenants more or less whole. $4,000 for 4 years as a rent supplement, and that amount of money could be used as a down payment to buy a house. So the legislation over time does improve financial compensation, but a lot of it comes after the program is basically coming to an end. As far as owner-occupiers, I mentioned contract sales as one of the major ways we can track this. And this is part of the terms of a contract sale. The purchaser understands and agrees that their occupancy of the premises is by sufferance and permission of the seller. And if any of the terms and conditions of the contract are broken by the buyer, the contract is canceled and annulled at the option of the seller, and he may be dispossessed by summary proceedings. In other words, evicted. So families buying houses on contract did not build equity the way that a traditional mortgage did. In the case of Newburgh, the property acquisition and relocation file for Mrs. Elizabeth Patton traced how this actually worked. She had a house that she bought on contract, and she refused to move. Quite frankly, just when Urban Renewal Agency relocation officers came to her door, she said, "No, I'm not moving. This is my house." Well, long and short of it is she had to move. And in her file were several letters to, from, and about her. And this is a letter from her. She had moved to Chicago, but wanted to know if she could move back to Newburgh and whether the Urban Renewal Agency would help her in that move. And in the letter, she says, "It may just be a house to you, but it was my home." And that kind of encapsulates what Mark Freed called grieving for a lost home, starting the west end of Boston, the Urban Renewal Project there. This is a project undertaken by one of the Boston hospitals, and they uncovered, the researchers, especially Mark Freed, uncovered a lot of psychological trauma from losing home and community. And they likened it, Freed likened it to losing a family member, the death of a family member. And more recently, Mindy Folov has written several books. She's a psychiatrist at the New School. She's written several books, including one called Root Shock, about the traumatic experience of being uprooted for urban redevelopment or gentrification. Condemnation blight, again, the issue here was the long time elapsed between a city announcing, "Hey, we're going to do an urban renewal project in this neighborhood," and the city actually acquiring the property. And federal regulations stipulated that a municipality could only pay what the building was worth at the time of the taking, not what it had been worth when the project had been announced. And in this case, again, from Newburgh, this is a building owned by Lucille Watson, at 181 Water Street in the first urban renewal project area. This contained 2 businesses and 4 apartments. She sued the city, and the case went to condemnation court. And the transcript of the proceedings is in the Newburgh Urban Renewal Agency records at Albany's special collections. And she basically says, look, I bought this building in 1954 for X amount of dollars. I put in a new central heating system. I updated the electric. I put in new bathrooms, and this cost, X more dollars. And, the businesses and tenants, I was very careful who I rented to. I wanted this to be a nice place to live for people. And, it generated income for me. So, I put in, let's say $25,000 to buy the building and improve it. And I was, generating $1,000 a year in rental income. And now the city of Newburgh wants to acquire it for $15,000. So she actually took the urban renewal agency to court, hired an appraiser, and did not get the full value of what she thought she was entitled to, but received more than the urban renewal agency had initially offered. As far as business relocation, 105,000 businesses were displaced nationally. 30 to 40% were unwilling to start up business in new locations, especially neighborhoods serving a neighborhood clientele, and especially businesses operated by older people. It simply became, if you're in your 60s or 70s, you might have a shoe repair shop or a small grocery store, and you might not be thinking about retiring, but it's really hard if you're elderly to restart a business in a new location. Great example of this is Kingston's B&F supermarket. And this photograph here, taken by a man named Gene Donner, who graciously shared his photo collection with us. This shows the supermarket on the corner, and the owner of the store, you see the delivery truck kind of in the lower right. The owner of the store is outside the store carrying loaves of bread, and you see in the background a wrecking ball and demolition happening all around the store. The city of Kingston asked the owner to remain in business until residential relocation had been completed. And he did so kind of as a public service. And here's a newspaper article about James Roberts, the owner, finally deciding to close despite the city of Kingston asking him to remain open. The reason for this, in the third column, second from the right, the paragraph that says the prime target is a 5-acre site running up Broadway. The city of Kingston had intended, this is kind of famous, we just refer to it as Dispo Parcel 8, because the city of Kingston has tried to dispose of this parcel 8, for 50 years and has been unable to. So it's kind of locally notorious. They're going to build a supermarket shopping plaza, and the city of Kingston thought that was right around the corner. They thought A&P was going to build a supermarket as part of a shopping plaza on that site. So the B&F market would no longer be needed. Well, it turns out A&P pulled out and the site has remained vacant to this day. So just some final thoughts on this work. The kind of obvious, but I think I can't stress this enough, even though it may sound obvious. People are really interested in the history of their places. When we were traveling around the state looking at urban renewal records in, say, Western New York last summer, Hornell, Olean, Salamanca, Penn Yan, Auburn, everyone we talked to said, oh, you're researching urban renewal? Well, urban renewal killed our downtown. I can't count how many people have claimed that in various locations. And they would also in the next breath say, you see where that whatever is now, that used to be such and such. So even people who are not alive for these urban renewal projects, people in their 30s or 40s or even younger, still have heard these stories from their elders. And these are the history of urban renewal is firmly embedded in how a community thinks of its history. The second point is that to do a social history of urban renewal, you really need the local records to tell that story. Again, like I said earlier in the presentation, if you went to National Archives too, and you looked at the HUD records or the Urban Renewal Administration records, you would come out with a policy history. That's a fairly dry history. It doesn't get to the people. In order to get to the people and the community, you need to use these local records. Third, and I think I kind of covered this when I talked about people being really interested in their community's history. The importance of community elders is very significant. I'm going to be redundant. I was almost said the importance of community elders is very important. Sorry about that. Especially among African American communities, elders and their stories and experiences are extremely important to how the community understands urban renewal and the losses and trauma associated with it. And the fourth consequence or final thought I would leave you with is that all levels of government bear responsibility for the financial and psychological damage done. The federal government provided most of the funding. The state government provided some of the funding, and through the Division of Housing and Community Renewal provided some expertise and guidance. The State Department of Transportation often built arterials that displaced more people from urban renewal project sites. And local governments applied for federal funding, planned these projects, hired the consultants and developers and contractors to do these projects. So these were all three levels of government bear some responsibility for making people whole for financial and psychological damages. And that's my final slide. So I will escape out of the presentation and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, David. Fascinating research. I'm not sure if our Q&A is working for asking questions, and if you're having trouble with it, feel free to use the chat if you want to post a question. But in the meantime, I wanted to open it up for any immediate questions that anyone might have. Feel free to unmute and ask. Jamie, go ahead.
Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
David, so good to see you.
You too, Jamie. How have you been?
Your presentation is wonderful. The work your folks are doing, incredibly interesting, really important stuff.
Thank you.
So many questions to ask. I'll limit myself to a couple quick ones. I might have missed it at the beginning. What's the broader project aims here? You've taken this presentation and the research and are sharing it with communities. Are you aiming to make a lot of the documents that you have created directory of available publicly? Is there a website or other sort of public history availability of the research that you aim to make available?
That's a great question, Jamie. And I am an idiot because I forgot to include one of the major projects that we did. So as part of that inventorying grant that the state archives is administering or has administered, the grant ended at the end of June. I want to pop this into the chat. The state archives has a program called Consider the Source New York, and we've contributed about 300 digital assets and 2 lesson plans already. These are resources for educators. There's another couple hundred assets that I've made available to the archive staff, and they're just backed up right now. So all told, there'll probably be around 500 to 600 photographs, sound recordings, and a few Super 8 films that we've contributed. So I should have discussed that, and I apologize for not. So that's one major thing, trying to get this into the class, into the middle school and high school classroom. To answer your question more directly, we had received planning, two NEH, three NEH grants, two planning grants, and a prototyping grant for through their digital projects for the public funding opportunity. And in 2022 and 2023, we applied for production funding, and we were denied both times. And we decided to, the three historians and the two web developers that we were working with, we decided to get off the grants treadmill. So unfortunately, the vision we had for this statewide history as a digital project for the public, it's going to have to take another form. I'm working with Humanities in with the Empire State Library Network to build a digital exhibit and a physical traveling exhibit that will be on NewYorkHeritage.org. So we will have a digital presence, just not the really nice built one, like a custom website built by two really skilled web developers. So that's one arm of the project. The rest of the research, we're debating, the three historians on the project, well, the three of us now, are debating whether to do a book aimed at a broad audience through a trade press. We've been in conversation with Cornell's trade imprint, Three Hills, or whether to just engage in a more social media and article-based research and publication strategy to, we have a Substack, whether we engage with the public through Substack and other social media outlets, and then spin off articles in scholarly journals about some of the work we're doing. So we're not clear what direction ultimately this will take. And because we had hoped that we would be able to produce the website we are calling Picturing Urban Renewal. Does that answer?
Sorry that didn't play out that way, but those options all sound great. I'll just ask one more question. Before I do, please be sure to give Anne my regards.
Thank you.
You had mentioned the difficulty in getting access to some of the records from particular municipalities. I'm curious if their reluctance to make that available is simply reputational in the context of how much urban renewal is a wound on community, the communities themselves, or would it put them at some sort of legal risk based on precedents that I don't know exist or not? So I'm asking, do they exist, of suits being taken by either displaced or their descendants for financial compensation from municipalities?
So three sub answers to that question. First of all, as far as the case history of this has gone up to the Supreme Court at least once, probably more times than I'm aware of. It is settled case law that municipalities have the power to use eminent domain to eliminate slums and blight, even if it means turning private property over to another private owner, which is what urban renewal in fact did. Took private property owned by one group of people, seized it through eminent domain, and then the city sold that land to another private party. That's been held to be legal, and I don't know, the ethics of the morality or justice of it to one side, that's been held to be perfectly within a municipality's right to do so through the eminent domain power. And municipalities are creatures of the state, so in effect, it's a transfer of the state power of eminent domain to urban renewal agencies around the state. The second answer, sometimes, I think in one case, you're right that it's embarrassment or an unwillingness to face the past. And that example is Rockville Center on Long Island. Their urban renewal program explicitly targeted the African-American neighborhood there. And the Nassau County Commission on Human Rights did a study in the mid-60s in which they quoted a municipal official who basically said, look, the Black people can find other communities on Long Island to move into. So when we contacted Rockville Center in 2018 to ask about the records, the village historian there literally replied to us, literally saying, these records are only for people living in Rockville Center. You are outsiders. You cannot look at these. So I think in Rockville Center's case, that embarrassment about this, overtly racist urban renewal program, that might be the case. Yeah. The third answer, quite frankly, is kind of cultural. I mentioned Long Island. Every time I contacted Long Island municipalities, not every time, but most times, their response was, oh, White Plains too, I think was also embarrassed. But on Long Island, the response was almost always file a FOIL and then we'll never respond to it. Western New York, I called up the city clerk at Hornell or Olean. I'm like, I want to come out and look at the records, last week of August. I'm like, sure, come on out. We'll set you up in a conference room and bring the records to you. So I think part of it is Western New York is really the Midwest. So culture can explain part of that too. Is that maybe more of an answer than you bargained for?
Thanks, Jamie, and fascinating. The many New York states within New York State that we're seeing culturally, politically. The Q&A is open if you want to write a question. Any other questions that someone had? Feel free to raise your virtual hand or just unmute. Think about if you have questions. In the meantime, I had a question, David. Of course, as you were speaking, I kept thinking about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses and the kind of the dominance of the battle between the little lady of Greenwich Village and her actually very complicated politics as a libertarian, and Robert Moses, of course, this great figure of urban renewal in New York City. And I guess I just wondered for your perspective on how the research you've done at the local level in the rest of New York State kind of relates to the dominant story in this kind of historiography of urban renewal in New York City and the kind of the battles between Jacobs and Moses. Is it part of that same story? Is it different? Where does this research relate to these big urban historiographies and questions?
Yeah, one of our strategies has been to look at places like Jamestown, Dunkirk, Olean, Ogdensburg, because we tend to think of urban renewal as something big cities did, but more money went to cities with fewer than 100,000 or even 50,000 people than went to the major cities, more federal money anyway. So my goal, one of my career goals was to be the only American urban historian to not have read The Power Broker. Unfortunately, I read The Power Broker. It's a good book, it's long. We wanted to impress on people that scale matters, that if you're just looking at Chicago, San Francisco, New York City, you're losing a lot of this history. So that scale matters. And urban history is not just the history of big cities. It's the history of smaller places that are still, resolutely urban. The second thing to say, I also hope to avoid doing anything with New York City because it's complicated. My two colleagues talked me out of that, and we did substantial research in the New York City Municipal Archives this past May. And I've been kind of doing a lot of interlibrary loan research, primary source documentation, through reports and such through interlibrary loan. The interlibrary loan folks have been fantastic. So I just want to give a shout out to them. New York City was very different. Every municipality in the United States, the 1,258 that had urban renewal projects, all of them except New York City, according to federal regulations, could not choose a developer until the land was cleared. And then they would have to find a developer through a competitive bidding process. Robert Moses had an urban revitalization program already going in New York City. Stuyvesant Town and Riverton, which were metropolitan life insurance company projects predate Title I of the 1949 Housing Act. So what Moses said, Moses picked developers, or he called them sponsors, picked sponsors before the project even got federal funding. So in the case of Lincoln Center, for example, probably one of the most famous urban renewal projects in the country, Moses approached the Rockefellers, I forget which Rockefeller brother, said, hey, look, why don't we put a Center for the Performing Arts in Lincoln Square, tear down Lincoln Square and build in San Juan Hill and build this Performing Arts Center. And then he went to Fordham University and said, hey, wouldn't you guys like a nice downtown Manhattan campus? So Moses picked the sponsors in advance. And then when the federal government said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that, he's like, stop me. So the other thing that's different about New York City because of this issue with Moses choosing the sponsors beforehand, all other urban renewal agencies or redevelopment authorities around the country had to, by federal regulation again, manage the relocation process. What Moses did is he said to the sponsor, relocation is your headache. The city of New York is not getting involved in relocating tenants from your project area. And this could play out really badly for most urban renewal relocation offices tried to be fairly humane with the relocation process. Try to match people with apartments, had lists of apartments, would inspect apartments to make sure they were so-called standard dwelling units. In New York City, the sponsors were tasked with this and they regarded this as a cost center that would cut into their profits. So relocation often went very poorly. The best example of this is the Penn Station South project in Chelsea. This was done by the Amalgamated or the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. I'd have to look up the specific union that did this. So you'd think that a leftist Marxist union would be more sensitive to the needs of the residents they're relocating. They were not. This was an area with a lot of rooming houses, and to get people to move faster, they went into the rooming houses and confiscated the towels and the bedding, the linens, from the boarding house residents. So New York City is a totally different animal when it comes to federal urban renewal. And there are other reasons too, involving the New York City Housing Authority, the bridges that Moses built, which displaced a lot of people, the Cross Bronx Expressway. I mean, New York City is just, and the figure of Moses himself, who dominated this until 1960. The first decade of the program in New York was entirely run out of Moses's office with zero transparency. Does that answer, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just struck that it seems like although New York City, as is often the case, is its own kind of beast, and its own politics, its own world in a way. One of the things I sense in your research is if that's a difference, one of the similarities seems to be the way in which the federal involvement brought out the different interests within local settings. Right. And here you see, of course, racism rears its head in many places, but I'm also seeing the examples you're giving of kind of, different interests within localities vying for, kind of profit, control, visions of the future. I mean, municipal politics becomes the story, in a sense, of the federal involvement. So even though the money is coming in many respects at the federal level, this is really a local story in the sense
Yeah.
of the political, urban historical story.
Another way to think about the two main ways that I would encourage you to think about urban renewal is as a subsidy to developers. And I stressed that in my presentation. The second way to think about it is that it totally reconfigured the relationship between the federal government and cities. Before urban renewal, I mean, look, every historical episode or trend or event has an antecedent. So to be totally fair, we could go back to the Public Housing Act of 1937 and say the same thing, but that was a much smaller program. What the urban renewal program did is traditionally federal money would go to the state, and then the state would, depending on the program, distribute that money to municipalities within the state. But the federal government, because cities are creatures of state legislation, what the urban renewal program did is short-circuited that process and created a direct and lasting relationship between the federal government and city governments. So this is a really novel departure in American federalism. I'm not sure that cities really competed for scarce funding except toward the end of the program under Nixon. Generally speaking, any municipality that applied for federal funding got a hearing. And the federal government would generally help a municipality revise its application. A lot of smaller places did not have, a small city is not going to have a planning staff, whereas a city like Boston or New York will. So the federal government saw its role as providing professional support, technical support to municipalities who did not have internal planning capabilities. So in really significant ways, the urban renewal program reconfigures the relationship between the federal government and municipalities. I'm not sure if that answers exactly what you asked.
That's fascinating. I mean, these different levels of government and sort of how, as the federal government expands its role, at least financially,
Yeah.
at different political relationships developing among these levels. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand, unmute.
Jamie, you said you had other questions?
Yeah. I was waiting to see if anybody else jumped in, but I have one. I'm going to stumble through this. And it's kind of building on what Michael just asked. So when you emphasized in your presentation that urban renewal, and this was revelatory for me, was first and foremost a municipal project, right? And that many of the people who came to your presentations seem to regard urban renewal negatively. That's a kind of prevailing kind of Jane Jacobsy paradigm that we live in right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like they're under the impression that it was a federal imposition. Perhaps that's convenient in that it displaces responsibility from their own community, right?
Exactly.
But when I first heard you mentioning it as a municipal enterprise, I thought that maybe that was that part of the message there was your community had some progressive, quote unquote, capital P intentions here. But now what I'm hearing you say is that you're using that message, that part of the normative implication of that message is communities, you need to recognize your own responsibility for this history.
Yes.
And grapple with it at the ground and the gritty and the challenging level. Am I right in that latter kind of sense?
Yes. I'm working on this digital script for New York Heritage right now, and I came across a newspaper article, and it's worth quoting. This is from Lockport, and this is the section where I'm trying to contend with the mixed legacy of urban renewal. And a reporter for the Lockport Journal wrote in 2016, a friend of mine brought up urban renewal the other day, and I think we both cried. We've suffered collectively for the downtown development disaster of almost half a century ago, and we're still recovering from it. They literally nuked downtown on us. So it's not clear who they and us are, but this is clearly, the columnist is clearly setting up urban renewal in Lockport as something done to us, right? And that's how Lockport, or at least this reporter and his friend who cried thinking about the downtown that was lost, that's how they think about it. And that's really prevalent in Newburgh, because just like with Rockville Center on Long Island, Newburgh has a really ugly history of racism in city government. The first urban renewal program in Newburgh, the Water Street project, happened at the same time that the city hired, it's a city manager form of government, 5 city council members, 4 aldermen with the mayor presiding as the 5th. So a really small city council elected at large, which meant no minority representation. In 1961, the city council hired a man named Joseph Mitchell as its manager. Mitchell decided that the real problem with Newburgh was that the African American community, who had recently migrated from the South in the Second Great Migration, they were really coming to Newburgh to take advantage of the generous welfare policies, and that this was wrong. This is dragging Newburgh down. So he mandated that welfare recipients, and Newburgh was one of the only places in New York State, for whatever reason, that ran its own welfare program. This wasn't the county, this wasn't the state. So he decided that welfare recipients had to go to the police station to collect their checks. He was going to check to make sure that no able-bodied person was on the welfare rolls. So at the same time that urban renewal is happening to the Black community in Newburgh, 17% of the population is African American, 90+% of people displaced were African American. Just do the math. So at the same time that's happening, there's this welfare war. There's a great documentary, NBC white paper on the National Archives YouTube channel called The Battle of Newburgh, which talks about Joseph Mitchell's really punitive war against the poor. This partly is a result of this nationwide documentary seen by national audience on TV. The city fires Mitchell. Mitchell goes on to become the director of the Virginia White Citizens Council, and then ultimately the John Birch Society. So Newburgh's refusal to contend with this history is because I think there's an ugly story behind or juxtaposed with the history of urban renewal in Newburgh. So yes, I think that's part of the story. I also want to emphasize that there were some benefits to urban renewal. So the modern apartment or the modern dwelling unit, when you rent an apartment today, you can expect central heat, private bathroom with indoor hot indoor hot and cold running water, a kitchen with a stove and a refrigerator. You can expect that the municipality you're moving into has modern building codes, electrical codes, fire codes, etc. All that was a requirement of the federal government. If a city was going to take federal urban renewal dollars, it had to revise its building codes and update them to 1960s standards or 50 standards. And urban renewal agencies had to ensure that the people relocated were moving into these standard dwelling units. So in older neighborhoods, especially in, say, Manhattan and Brooklyn, the 5-story tenement walk-ups, a lot of those buildings did not have private bathrooms or central heat. And you had a lot of space heaters, oil-fired space heaters, which were very dangerous and caused a lot of fires. So urban renewal did improve the nation's building stock through requiring standard dwelling units and modern building codes. So I just want to emphasize that it's not all sad, but it's a lot sad. Does that answer?
I mean, that was actually going to be my last question, is if the term urban renewal has become so toxic that any sort of positive outcome that came from it, such as building codes and things like that, just are not associated with that or recognized as part of that history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another way to think about this is just in sheer quantitative terms. All 3 levels of government around the country spent $20 billion. 1.3 roughly million as a minimum, as a floor. It could be more, but we're conservative, methodologically conservative about that estimate. So $20 billion distributed among 1.3 million people, that works out to around $2,000 per capita. If that money had been given to households to rehabilitate their homes instead of demolishing them, we might be telling a different story about urban renewal today.
Fascinating, David. Those questions led me to ask one last brief question to you, and then maybe we'll break since it's getting later and we've been keeping you at it for a while. which is, today in the United States, and in New York State, let's just say, we face various issues. That there's still this problem of kind of downtowns that are struggling. There's, of course, a crisis just in having enough housing.
Yeah.
This is a major issue in both in New York State and in the country as a whole. How does this history that you're studying relate to some of our contemporary challenges with housing, with urban life?
That's a really great question with a complicated answer that I don't fully understand, or let me rephrase that. That's a great question, and I don't think anybody has the complete answer, quite frankly. Let me just put it this way, though, as something to think about. After World War II, before World War II, or before the Great Depression, the major problem confronting municipal officials was how to deal with growth. And if you look at Chicago, Buffalo, Rochester, Detroit, Cleveland, all of these cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were industrializing, economic activity was booming, downtown retail was going up, population was increasing. After World War II, the main problem confronting elected officials is how to manage decline. And if you look at a city like Albany, for example, with a downtown railroad station, rail traffic dries up. Hotel occupancy rates drop off a cliff. Retail activity goes down because retail is moving out to outlying shopping centers. The affluent white middle class is relocating to the suburbs thanks to FHA and VA mortgages. As an aside, the federal government's urban policy is really contradictory in this period. On the one hand, the federal government is facilitating suburbanization through FHA and VA mortgages and through the expressway construction, the interstate highway and urban expressway construction programs. Then on the other side of the coin, the federal government is saying, oh, cities are in trouble, we need to shovel money at cities. So urban history, again, the trajectory would be very different if the federal government had not subsidized suburbanization to the extent that it did through those programs. So that said, the major problem confronting elected officials after the war was how to deal with decline. And imagine you're running for election or re-election as mayor or city council member, and you get up in front of your constituents and you say, our town is declining. People are, affluent white families are moving out. Downtown department store sales are not what they were a decade ago. What we need to do is manage decline in a smart way. We need to acknowledge that we're declining and manage it. You would not get elected or re-elected if you ran on that platform, because your opponent or opponents would say, yeah, but the federal government's got this big pile of cash they're shoveling out the door to cities like ours. Let's take that money and then we can improve our tax base in our downtowns. Today, the dominant problem facing elected officials, it's almost like urban renewal succeeded too well over the long run. The dominant problem is how to make cities accessible and affordable to all residents, to all classes of economic classes and people of all backgrounds, really. But we're talking about, financial constraints in renting or buying. And that the challenge really now is affordable housing, is mixed income urban spaces. And I don't have the answer to that. I will also say that Richard Florida championed the creative class, a decade or 20 years ago, that his solution to urban decline was, let's get the creative economy going, the knowledge economy, get the artists and the coders and people like that to move into the city, and then the city will naturally rejuvenate. We just wrote a book a few years ago called The New Urban Crisis, where he basically said, all that stuff I wrote 20 and 10 years ago, that was wrong. So I don't know what the solution is. The other way to answer the question or come at your question is, what was the relationship between urban renewal and gentrification? That's a harder one to tease out because urban renewal is a federal program carried out by specific individuals in city government. You can look at the Urban Renewal Agency, and there are people responsible for doing this. Gentrification is a lot squishier. You don't have, are you going to demonize people who move into a city to rehab the historic structure? I mean, it's a lot slipperier. There is a direct connection early on in the 60s and 70s when there's the Back to the City movement, especially on the west side of New York, west side of Manhattan, rather. You see urban renewal being tightly tied into sweat equity rehabilitation, and then subsequent gentrification and unaffordability of a lot of the west side. So you can make a pretty strong case for that happening on the west side of Manhattan. It's a lot harder to make that strong connection in a place like Albany, which is a lot smaller. So complicated answer, but it's a complicated question.
Well, thank you, because of course, complexity is something historians are okay with, and uh, this really rich history of approaching urban renewal in New York State, not just through the dominant stories, but through this careful, textured, uh, local social history approach that involves archival sources and working with communities that uncover some really ugly stories and histories, and also seems to become in some places a way of people becoming more, interested in how to sustain their communities today by thinking about the past in serious ways and in all its complexity. And there's a lot about this project that's very valuable, and both for historians and for the broader public. So
Thank
it's
you.
really wonderful to hear about it today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to Lynn Ann and CPD for the technical help, and especially thank you to you, David, for sharing this research with us so generously.
Thank you. Happy to.
Thank you again. We'll be back, of course, on November 20th with April Maston, taking us back into the 19th century, but still a kind of urban history about Black and Irish relationships through dancing, entertainment, and culture. So we welcome you all to join us again then, and thanks again to everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks,
Thanks.
David. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.